A delightful blend of lavender, old paper, and freshly baked shortbread permeated the air on a balmy June afternoon in the village of Charlie Hollow. The rose bushes in Mrs. Felicity Murchison's cottage garden were abundant, to the point where visitors had to tip their teacups to avoid thorns as some of the branches leaned dangerously close to the cobblestone path. As an odd ritual that Felicity had started after the death of her third husband, she was holding her annual readings in the garden. Under the shady branches of her nailed apple tree, she would gather a select group of friends, relatives, and acquaintances every year to listen to readings of Victorian poetry. Seated in iron chairs in a semicircle, the guests spread out programs printed on creamstock. Lawrence Ashcombe, a well-known local schoolmaster with a strong baritone voice and an eccentric stage presence, stood at the center. As he read a particularly dramatic line from The Lady of Shalott, he carried a slim book in one hand and gestured with the other. In a chair that was significantly farther away from the others, Missy Marple sat towards the rear, wearing a straw hat decorated with a worn blue ribbon. She sipped her tea with a subtle expression of gratitude. On the other hand, her gaze darted from one thing to another, not in an impolite but inquisitive way, taking note of Mrs. Murchison's jaw line as she observed Lawrence, Mr. Edgar Gresham's firm grasp on his cane, and the barely discernible shudder that young Celia Dacres exhibited whenever the word curse was said. It seemed like a normal afternoon, but Miss Marple could feel tension lurking beneath the surface. When it wasn't appropriate, people grinned. Felicity was a split second late with her laughter, and Lawrence, in her mind, was not reading for fun. Applause echoed across the yard as he lowered the book, resembling the sound of a wind chime rattling in the wind. Standing up, Felicity said, "Thank you, Lawrence." She spoke the words that was utterly transporting, but her expression remained emotionless. Lawrence lowered his head once again and moved away, his eyes briefly meeting Celia's. Averting her gaze, the girl once more, tea was served. Refusing a second cup, Miss Marple pretended to admire the flower beds as she strolled to the edge of the garden, where a dilapidated sundial leaned over a sprig of wild rosemary. Following her in a loathly murmur were discussions of poetry and rhododendrons, but suddenly something else emerged. He made a mistake by reading that poetry. No one could hear the whisper because it was so low, especially in light of previous year's events. In a low, frantic voice, a man responded, "Be quiet, or else you'll have to start over." Instead of turning her head, Miss Marple merely dusted a flower off her sleeve. As the guests said their goodbyes and excuses, a piercing scream echoed around the lawn later that afternoon. It originated within the home, when Felicity Murchison needed more biscuits. She went inside to get them. Her back rested on the hearth as she sat on the floor of her library when they discovered her. Beside her, a tea tray was on its side. She had passed away. Just a look of sheer surprise on her face. No shattered glass. No obvious wounds. We'll go on to the next mystery. Drop a comment with your location if you're solving mysteries with us. If you want more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Even more somber will be tomorrow's case file. Keep your mind active. Second chapter. The garden tea had cooled and the cookies were still unopened when Dr. Hammond showed their. A pale-faced maid had led the guests into the drawing room, and they sat rigidly silent, not knowing whether to drink, stare, or converse. Standing silently by the entrance, Miss Marple studied the arrangement of the visitors like a jigsaw piece. By the window, Lawrence Ashcombe stood with his arms folded and his gaze agitated. Celia Dreer, clutching a crumpled serviette, Edgar Gresham, stooped over, his two hands firmly grasping his walking stick, as if he were staking his claim to the room at Felicity's side. Dr. Hammond knelt in the library. He was a stocky, middle-aged man who was known for being more reserved than inquisitive, and he had steady hands. After a thorough examination that took several minutes, he stood up and, with an audible sigh, fastened the buttons of his jacket. No injury, no fall, he informed Inspector Cray, who had just come from the Lower Grenell police station. And no sign of seizure or convulsion either. Miss Marple, who had already heard this type of diagnosis, took a sip of the water that the maid had offered. Cray, a stocky man who squints suspiciously even when taking notes, questioned, "Would you call it natural causes?" "It is possible," that the physician said, "but I wouldn't be hasty. Her skin tone is off. Her curled fingers are a telltale sign of a potentially deadly toxin that could strike suddenly." As Craig's voice dipped, he inquired with a slight hesitation. The doctor nodded. "Maybe after the autopsy, we'll get additional information." Cray entered the drawing room while quietly muttering something. There was an instant change in the vibe. As if attempting to recall whether they had done something embarrassing, guests sat up straighter and breathed more deliberately. "A couple of inquiries from me are in order." Naturally, Lawrence responded without a hitch. When Craig declared everything is quite surprising. According to Edgar Gresham, Mrs. Murkison hosted this occasion annually, didn't she? His speech was thin and raspy. Poetry and tea has become somewhat of a ritual. Up until recently, it was mostly innocuous. Craig nodded in agreement. Was anything out of the ordinary going on with her today? Celia glanced up in a hurry. "I wanted to make sure she was okay before tea, so I inquired if she appeared preoccupied. She indicated she hadn't slept much." When Miss Marple noticed a hint of shame in Celia's statement, she tilted her head. She asked, "Did anyone help prepare the tea?" followed by a subtle twist of her fingers, as if someone had offered too much and regretted it. Cray inquired, Lawrence said when the housekeeper retrieved it. However, as usual, Felicity mixed everything herself. For it, she possessed a cabinet. Typically, herbal blends. A note was scratched by Cray, who else entered the residence just before she passed away. Then Edgar moved on to the next thing. "I had temporarily left my gloves in the study. I was just in the room for a minute, but I thought you might have seen Mrs. Murkison in the hallway." With care, Miss Marple advanced. "Apologies, Inspector, but may I ask something?" Cray seemed taken aback before tilting his head in the direction of Miss Marple. Her attention shifted to the rest of the group. Aside from the poetry, had anyone else heard anything out of the ordinary while we were outside? Celia cautiously turned her head towards Lawrence as he opened his mouth to speak. "I heard voices," she replied. "I believed it was just visitors, talking away from the crowd near the sundial and rosemary patch." "What did they say?" "I don't know. It was only a few words. The poem's inappropriateness is a factor." Lawrence looked down at his shoes and mumbled something about how he had picked out a dark pair. With an arched eyebrow, Cray was at the Lady of Shalot's poem. Miss Marple said with a tight smile, "It ends in death, doesn't it?" After writing down another fantastic idea, Craig remarked, "No one leaves the village tonight. We'll have someone stationed at the gate, routine measure." A hush fell over the room, but Miss Marple remained silent. Looking at the hearth, she did nothing more than fold her hands. Miss Marple later asked the maid if she may sit in the garden again as dusk settled in. For an instant, she tossed in that subtle sturdiness that nobody could ever dispute. The roses were winding down for the day, and the iron chairs lay neglected like artifacts. As she cautiously made her way to the sundial, Miss Marple glanced across at the trellis, where ivy was tangled in knots and loops. One of the cardstock readings from earlier was damp and half-creased, so she leaned slightly and brushed her hand over it before turning it over. The reverse was marked with a faint fingerprint. Surprisingly, there is hardly any. Miss Marple straightened up and turned her head to face the house as she spoke. Curious, more to the roses than herself. Very curious indeed. Chapter 3, next. To the sundial, beneath a sprig of crushed thyme. However, she refrained from touching the tiny glass vial. Charlie Hollow had a fragile calm the next morning. Bird songs and the courteous ring of bicycle bells, which have come to characterize the village, appeared to have gone missing. As the baker opened his shutters late and without his customary cheer, the sole thing that could be heard was the wind rustling through the hedgerows and the distant creek. Slowly, Miss Marple stirred her oats at St. Margaret's cottage. The glass vial, the thin fingerprint, and the peculiarly chosen poem were the objects of her obsession, rather than the oats. Inspector Cray was not informed about the vial by her. The idea that something so easily concealed could be hurriedly disregarded or inadvertently destroyed made her dislike premature speculation all the more. A faint rap on the door greeted Miss Marple just before 10 o'clock. "Skellia Darus," she whispered, already rising, even though her outfit was straightened and she held a shawl in one hand. The girl stood on the step, looking pale and tired, as if she had been up all night. She spoke rapidly. "I pray I am not disturbing." "No way, my dear. I was wondering if you wanted tea or something heavier for the day, so I invited you in." Into the sitting room, Miss Marple guided her, and soft sunlight streamed in through the lace curtains. Celia sat on the cushions, but she didn't let herself relax. "I couldn't sleep," she confessed. "I kept thinking about yesterday." Miss Marple waited, and "I didn't care for Felicity Murkison, though I never hoped for her." Celia said, "You are aware that in reality, nobody does mildly." Miss Marple certainly. Not on purpose, whatever the case may be. A considerable halt. It was humiliating how she treated me. Celia softly murmured I had no choice but to make a scene when she informed everyone at last year's gathering that I was engaged to Thomas before I had even agreed to it. When I heard about the cancellation, Miss Marple replied kindly, "It must have been difficult." The fact that I lacked the confidence and attractiveness to command higher salaries was, she assured me, for my own good. Though her countenance remained calm, Miss Marple's fists clenched a little bit over the teacup. "Dear Celia, I'd rather you hear this from me than hear it whispered later, so why are you telling me this now?" Her red eyes betrayed her sincerity. Miss Marple slowly nodded. Reality divulged willingly is usually not as risky as information discovered after the fact. Miss Marple gently patted Celia's hand as she stood up to depart, asking, "Did you hear anything else by the sundial, Celia? Was there anything you were going to say yesterday but didn't?" As soon as the word arsenic was brought up, I believed it was only a figment of my imagination. Miss Marple expressed her gratitude and escorted her to the gate, observing her cautious, fearful feet as she retreated. Inspector Cray paid a visit to the cottage later that day. Without introducing himself, he declared that arsenic was present. It may not be much, but it will do the trick, especially if no one was expecting it. How was it added to her tea? Even after rinsing the cup, traces of it remained. With the exception of one that had fallen over and broken, all of the guests' cups were clean, and Miss Marple just nodded. We uncovered it amidst the garden hedge. Curious, I was hoping someone could know if Miss Marple might get her hands on the blend. Did she not secure it in a kitchen cabinet? That's right. However, someone could have tampered with it before she brewed it, since the key was on her apron, Craig growled. Exactly. With a little lean, Miss Marple stepped forward. Before Craig blinked. You knew Lawrence Ashcombe for years. Someone I knew once was a bit of a showman, but he was harmless. He would read Byron at funerals while forging signatures in the spaces between stanzas. You believe Ashcombe had an agenda? I suppose he picked a rather incisive poetry for a lady like Felicity Murkison, and Craig couldn't help but laugh uncontrollably. As she stood up to get a little envelope, Miss Marple stated, You might want to give this a try. I left it untouched yesterday while it was beneath the rosemary shrub. Her gesture of passing him the bottle on a folded handkerchief aroused Craig's furrows. People don't conceal things unless they're in a rush, so I'm curious why you found it there. She said someone dropped a program, but it was left in a hurry and wasn't intentionally placed. Craig plundered the vial with caution. I appreciate it, Miss Marple. He hesitated before he departed. Additionally, we have spoken with Jane, the maid. The only people who handled the glasses, she claims, were Felicity and herself. A furrow formed on Miss Marble's brow as the tray, contrary to her assertion. She did not take it with her when she answered the door. Instead, she placed it on the sideboard. Just a second, there's plenty of time for that. Marple, miss, whispered Cray, departed with the vial, yet remained beset with unexplained mysteries. Nonetheless, Miss Marple returned to the garden later that afternoon. By now, the roses had widened. In the midday heat, and from behind the church, a bell rang out the hour. Near her foot, a sparrow perched on a crumb. Looking over the hedge, Miss Marple, a cup had been shattered. Someone has spoken arsenic out loud while reading a selected poetry. Maybe without thinking, or maybe as a warning. The choice of poetry is seldom accidental, she mumbled, her thoughts racing with a single line. She hath a lovely face, God in his mercy lend her grace. Chapter 4. The following day. Local solicitor, Mr. Henry Blatchley, who appeared as though he had never raised his voice or misplaced a document, oversaw the burial arrangements for Felicity Murkison with grim efficiency. Until Charlie Hollow's death, Blay seldom showed up to his social events. It was never Miss Marple's style to pry. Still, she graciously accepted Felicity's invitation to her home to help catalogue her book collection for a nearby charity auction. A small but impressive collection of rare books and poems, many of which had thoughtful annotations in the margins, could be found in the Murkison Library. Unlocking the library door for Felicity, Blay noted that she had a tendency to annotate her opinions, some of which were pretty blunt. She was never renowned for being soft-hearted. Miss Marple's response was gentle. As if entering a confession box, she made her way into the library. There was a subtle aroma of dried lavender and oiled wood throughout the room, which was polite but alert. Once upon a time, there was an overturned tea tray. Miss Marple cast a sidelong glance at the hearth where Felicity had been discovered. After giving herself time to process the mental image, she shifted her focus to the shelves. She was left alone with a catalogue sheet and a pencil after Bley excused himself. The books were not Miss Marple's first venture, though. On the old desk next to the window, which had floral inlay and a propensity to stick slightly when opened, she settled down to write. A drawer containing carefully organized envelopes and ink bottles was yanked open by her. A slim leather notebook, 2 sealing stamps, and the notepad remained closed. She instead took a quick look at the envelopes, the majority of which were empty except for one that had a folded sheet inside. Absent postage and address, she unfurled the paper and said, Felicity, if you read it aloud, I will consider us even. But if you say anything else, I swear I will take everything from you." The writing was intentional, but slanted, with variable pressure, a trained deceit. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly at the borders of the page. With great care, she returned the note and proceeded to the poetry shelf. A thin ribbon of blue was tied around the Lady of Shallott's neck. She released the volume and flipped to the page she had marked. Lawrence had read aloud a piece, and Felicity had jotted down a single line in the margin. "Not mine, but is returning the book to its proper place," Miss Marple continued. Near the garden path, an apparition materialized outside the window. It was Inspector Cray and Lawrence Ashcombe. For an instant, she peered through the drapes. Lawrence's stance had transformed from dramatic to measured, and his voice had lowered. Unconvinced, Cray appeared. To meet them, Miss Marple discreetly exited by a side door and walked around. "My goodness, Miss Marple, Mr. Ashcombe was merely willing to assist with Felicity's paperwork, according to Cray." She nodded slightly and asked, "You, Lawrence, do you know my tastes?" I confidently responded, "Yes." We had many conversations about literature, and she put her trust in me to keep her readings and secrets organized. "Excuse me," he blinked. With a smile, "Miss Marple, nothing valuable. I was simply wondering what kind of poem is most effective when trying to convey a certain point." You knew Lawrence kept herbal blends in a secure location because Cray cut him off just as he was about to speak. Was anyone ever tampered with them? She was quite fussy about it. Lawrence spoke gently. What the maid said took her by surprise. Though she never accused anyone of anything more than incompetence, Jane did oversteep the chamomile. After staring at him for an uncomfortable amount of time, Miss Marple looked over to Cray and said, "I would like to speak with Jane." "I didn't poison her, if that's what you're thinking," Jane said without prompting. "I rarely think anything too quickly," Miss Marple said kindly, and the maid was discovered near the side porch. Her hands reeked from soap and her eyes darting anxiously as she approached. "I won't be long," Miss Marple assured, settling on a bench nearby. "I simply wondered if Mrs. Murkison had received any unusual letters recently." At that point, Jane said, "I didn't read her mail." "Obviously not, but you may have seen a stampless envelope. I once discovered something that was handed-given instead of posted," with Jane's lips squeezed together. It had slipped under the door. On the exterior, it appeared to be her handwriting, but on the inside, I couldn't decipher a word. She left it open on the desk, and I just had a glimpse of a few words. "Is it possible that you may remember any of those phrases?" Jane was hesitant. It made a passing reference to reading aloud to even the score. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "Thanks a lot, Jane. Just watch out when you polish that tray. Rubbing it raw will reveal that it is largely plating, despite its silver appearance." As Miss Marple made her way back to the house's entrance, she noticed Edgar Gresham waiting at the hedge's corner. He exhibited an unusual lack of movement as he gazed across the grass, devoid of his customary pipe smoke. As she went by, he turned around and nodded firmly, but he said nothing. When Miss Marple returned to her home, she sat down in her parlour for a while to gather her notes. Arsenic in a vial next to a sundial, the fragments taking shape as if simply a letter with a menacing tone or a poetry with purposeful wording. Finally, "Please repeat this strange phrase." Under her brow, Miss Marple furrowed Chapter 5. 2 days after Felicity's death, the village of Charlie Hollow attempted to return to its routine. But routine, like trust, is easily broken. The warning had not been about speaking in general, but about public exposure, about a reading, yes. However, this reading posed a far greater danger than verse 5. Despite a shaky sermon due to distraction, the vicar's voice resounded through the chapel on Sunday. The postman began his route, and the bakery reopened. But deep down, the discussion had become more tense. Close to hedgerows, people whispered, as she did with most things while cutting the lavender hedge outside her gates. Miss Marple noticed that doors were shut more firmly and that Mrs. Alpha Gresham Edgar's sister-in-law and widow of his younger brother, was spotted strolling to the Ears Jav churchyard twice in one morning. As Alpha stepped into the chapel, she noticed that she glanced over her shoulder. Edgar Gresham, who was always on time, stopped taking his afternoon stroll altogether, and she saw that Jane, the maid, no longer brought the mail to Felicity's house, but instead brought it to Mr. Bley. It was mid-afternoon when Alpha came to visit. As she delicately accepted Miss Marple's invitation to tea, she remarked, "Lavender always makes a garden look like it has secrets." With her customary elegance, Miss Marple poured, "Maybe all it does is hide them." Alpha chuckled with fragility. "It seems like everyone is assuming I was involved," she remarked, tapping her fingers on the teacup. "I don't think anyone said anything," Miss Marple said. However, her observation led her to believe that quiet frequently conceals more responsibility than accusation. Felicity had a knack for throwing off the equilibrium, so Alpha leaned back. Since that last will modification, she has always considered herself to be a cut above the rest of us. It was changed by Miss Marple without her batting an eye. Remember how Edgar was enraged when he learnt she had bequeathed the garden property to Lawrence Ashcombe? It was only a month ago. The Murkizan family supposedly owned it for 3 generations. After one stir, Miss Marple's tea was ready. "Gradually, it's becoming clear to me. Was the present intended to be sentimental?" With a smile that was more dramatic than friendly. Alpha Felicity loved Lawrence until their February argument, but she preferred to be remembered for her kindness rather than her resentment. According to Edgar, Felicity would choose death than accept her mistake. He accused her of betrayal and said she had no concept of family loyalty. Miss Marple gave a meaningful nod, but she never went back and changed the answer. Edgar is still bitter about her. There was a revised will, a contested garden, a poet who had been given land by a woman with whom he had lately had a falling out, and Althea's eyes followed the curve of the road as she left Miss Marple's garden, all the way to the Ashcombe cottage. Later that night, Inspector Cray came back with some news. The disturbing note's handwriting reads, "It's definitely not Felicity. But the odd thing is, it's not Lawrence Ashcombe's either. No." An eyebrow was arched by Miss Marple. "Actually, we compared samples from his previous school applications, and they don't match." "That's interesting," she remarked. "Is there any update on the leftover arsenic in the vial poison?" "Very same chemical as Felicity's killer, missing fingerprints. Probably cleaned as Miss Marple savoured her tea." The inspector asked if anyone had witnessed Felicity's argument the day before she passed away. Cray nodded in agreement. Jane said that she overheard people yelling in the library, but she thought Felicity was just being dramatic as usual. Whom she had never met before, but with whom she had overheard conversations regarding her knowledge, and was no longer silent. Marple Miss reclined, "Did Felicity have any secret diaries?" Curry scowled. "Not that any of I recommend inquiring with Mr. Bley about any removals that may have taken place prior to the arrival of your officers, even if she might not have used that exact term. People have a tendency to conceal serious ideas in the most unlikely of locations." Scratching his chin, "Egg, in your opinion, The note isn't the sole cautionary signal. The hushed tones of Miss Marple's voice led me to believe that Felicity was getting ready for something, and that she had decided to send a message through a reading public performative. Unfortunately, the message was abruptly cut off. A note was discovered tucked into the side of Miss Marple's garden gate the next morning. Along with the rain, a single sentence on a folded page, no stamp or envelope. There was no signature, and he was never meant to consume it. It was for her. She set it on the kitchen island and pondered its meaning for quite some time. Most importantly, who was he who had altered the course of action? In the afternoon, Miss Marple gathered her umbrella and made her way to the cottage of Lawrence Ashcombe. Squeaking with weariness, the worn gate stood guard at the village's border, surrounded by dense hedges. Lawrence answered the door with a damp cloth over his shoulder and the faint smell of ink in the air. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed in astonishment. "I wasn't expecting." "No one ever expects me," she responded. "Might I come in?" He was taken aback before he moved aside. Although the home was small, the shelves were crammed with books. The windowsill was cluttered with stacks of paper. On a nearby side table, a tea tray remained warm. Lawrence tensed up a little as Miss Marple's eyes silently swept the room, stopping at each item on the shelves, desks, and trays. "You were close to Felicity once, weren't you? All she did was leave your land because she liked my voice." He averted his gaze. "No one asked me for it." "No, but you did agree to read the assigned material." "You believe I poisoned her, Lawrence?" After weeks of silence, unresponsive, Miss Marple reached across the table and took up Felicity's copy of The Lady of Sherwood, the blue ribbon clinging to the cover. Her voice was barely audible as she whispered, "To Lawrence, you kept it. I was going to return it, but she'd marked it with a note in the margin about you," he said. "It wasn't supposed to go that far." Miss Marple gave him a cautious glance. Then another one continued it. Unit 6, the morning following Miss Marple's visit to Lawrence Ashcombe. The rain whipped the hamlet alleys into silver ribbons. Trees and homes were obscured by a light fog that lingered on the hills. Silence, like grief, fell over the room. Seated in silence within the cottage of St. Margaret, returning to her writing desk, Miss Marple studied the unsigned message that had been placed at her gate, having moved from the window. She was meant to drink it, not him. All night long, the cue had stuck with her. Its structure was strange, but its implications were straightforward. An admission rather than an explanation that indicated the aim was still there, but it had changed. The silence was shattered just before midday by a tap. With a wet brow furrowed, Inspector Cray said, "I thought you'd want to." "No," he remarked, entering the room before the tea was ready. There was something strange about the will, according to Felicity's solicitor. As she cocked her head, Miss Marple, she amended the new version twice in the 3 days leading up to her death, repeating, not revoked, amended. This was the version that left the garden property to Lawrence. In the event that Lawrence would not accept the bequest, Edgar Gresham would become the legal owner. The fact that Edgar appeared so distressed, despite the fact that he would gain, piqued Miss Marple's interest. Exactly according to Grace, according to Blay, Felicity asked for it following a troubling discussion with Lawrence. Without getting into specifics, he did observe that she appeared frightened. On her way to the mantelpiece, Miss Marple ran her fingertips over its edge. Just when Felicity was about to switch allegiances, someone stopped her in her tracks. With his arms folded, "Cray, the identity of the tea temper remains unknown." "No, but it does shed light on why someone may have wanted her silenced prior to that amendment taking effect. Cray slowly nodded and then produced something else. An evidence bag containing a folded piece of paper. Jane discovered this concealed behind a cabinet drawer. Seems like a ripped page from a journal or correspondence isn't the same as Felicity's. Miss Marple looked it over. She claims she will read it out loud, but that won't happen if she values her peace of mind. The last remark was mumbled again, indicating that she may not remember what we buried. Assuming she recalls the items we interred, curious, Cray asked, buried. Miss Marple took a while to respond. Rather than that, she set the bag aside. Mrs. Elisa Wilmot, who is Mrs. Murder's housekeeper in the past, has to be contacted. Months ago, she hung up her shades. She does, however, reside close to the orchard, just beyond the abandoned railway line. Craig shot her a tired expression. You believe she has knowledge, but I believe she recalls details that people have opted to ignore. I told the police what I could, Eliza Wilmot said politely, her shawl draping over her shoulders. I'm not here officially, Miss Marple clarified, just as a woman trying to make sense of what another woman left unsaid. That seemed to soften the older woman. Inside, she escorted Miss Marple to a room with a softly crackling fire and the aroma of freshly baked apples. Eliza, Miss Marple asked in a low voice, do you remember anything out of the ordinary about Mrs. Murchison's conduct last winter? The maid hesitated. She teased softly. She stopped going into the east room. When the tea kettle was halfway on the tray, she complained of headaches whenever she looked at the rose garden. She insisted that I scrubbed the floor twice in a week, and I thought she was completely insane since she kept muttering something about something leaking through. With a little lean, Miss Marple stepped forward. Was there ever anything mentioned about buried, unmoving Elizabeth's hands on one chilly day? When we were restocking the old trunks, she pointed out I should have burned it, not buried it. Upon my inquiry as to her meaning, she responded, never mind, it's too late now. As she placed her cup down, Miss Marple was Lawrence Ashcombe, a regular that winter. Oh, absolutely. He dropped over with poetry and advice and was really family. However, Edgar Gresham, his and Felicity's roses were the kind that make the air smell bad for hours after they bloom. And Eliza hesitated. She had begun to threaten to make things public, and he didn't appreciate that she kept so many records. At the thought of reading anything out loud that could infuriate someone, Elizabeth's expression hardened. Indeed, her statement was at tea one day. She began reading what seemed like a poem, but she soon began inserting lines that weren't in the book, along with her own name and the dates. For some reason, Lawrence's face lost all of its color. Prior to the final verse, he departed. Miss Marple took it all in quietly. The fog had become heavier and the temperature had dropped by the time she stepped out of the cottage. That night, she spread out all of her belongings on the kitchen table. Both the poem's amended version and the margin note contain a menacing tone. Not mine, but his. The message was intended for her, but it was anonymous. The housekeeper had finally admitted that something had been kept from her laid to rest, despite Felicity's knowledge. She attempted to speak in a performance rather than a confessional tone. Somebody in that garden had the bright idea that the past wouldn't remain hidden if the truth were to emerge, and they arranged the reveal using poetry. Never going to work for them, Part 7, the subsequent morning, the precipitation ceased, causing Charlie Hollow, a village, to become slippery and shimmer in the dim light of day. Puddles glistened like small panes of glass as water clung to rose petals and slithered across cobblestone walkways. Despite leaving early with a light basket, and a cap pulled firmly beneath her chin. Miss Marple did not make it to the vicarage or the grocery store. Instead, she shifted her gaze to the boundary of Felicity Murchison's garden. More precisely, to the area beyond the eastern hedge, past the dilapidated sundial. Unfortunately, Felicity's previous attempts to transform the plot into a vegetable garden were unsuccessful. The earth remained parched, unyielding, and oddly devoid of life. Something fresh, however, had surfaced in the weeks following her passing. Steady, verdant shoots rising in neat roses from low to the ground, something very different. Not even vegetables or wildflowers. Miss Marple studied the plants with great care while kneeling down. It was no secret that foxgloves, while beautiful, are poisonous if eaten, and notoriously prolific seeders on disturbed soil. While delicately removing her skirt, she rose to her feet and observed an unusual dip in the ground close to the distant plant. In this case, a spade was utilized. Upon hearing footsteps behind her not long ago, she remained motionless. "Come on, I was hoping to find you here." The voice of Edgar Gresham, as Miss Marple slowed her movements. "Good morning," she said with a smile. Edgar, on the other hand, was unresponsive to the weather. He stood rigidly with his hands behind his back, making him uncomfortable. "You shouldn't be wandering here without permission," he observed. "I rather think Mrs. Murchison would have granted me a wide berth." Lightly, Miss Marple remarked, apart from the soil. He narrowed his gaze. "It was never a decent lack of proper drainage. I find it intriguing that something is currently growing." A frown spread across his face as he gazed at the foxglove. In particular, weeds can be quite tenacious when they emerge from soil that has just been turned over with a spade. A brief pause passed before he spoke up. "You're not the police, Miss Marple?" "No," she responded, "but I pay attention, and I know fear when I see it trying to look like anger." Her gentle interruption cut Edgar short as he retreated half a step, as if he had suddenly remembered himself. "If you've come to accuse me, absolutely not. You're much too careful with something so straightforward." He gazed at her for a moment before abruptly turning and departing. In his haste, he scampered over Miss. After seeing him leave, Marple went back to her house to look something up in her book. Foxglove has a long history of usage as a cardiac medicine, but in its raw form particularly, the leaves it might kill quickly. But they didn't know that arsenic was the poison that murdered Felicity. But the fact that it was there was significant. Someone had dug a grave here, and the earth had spoken. Later that day, Miss Marple visited solicitor and neutral expression. Expert Mr. Henry Blatchley, once more. "If this is about the inheritance matter, it's about what Felicity may have left behind," he murmured to Miss Marple as he offered her weak tea and a seat near the hearth in his book-lined office, maintaining his usual calm demeanor. Possibly illegal, if not documented. A blink from Bley. "Are you referring to a letter or some other document that someone was afraid might be read aloud?" Bley was taken aback. Within the narrow confines of a private folder was a file. "Last winter, she gave it to me and requested that I secure it with a will." A glare formed in Miss Marple's eyes. "Sure, you did. However, I went to get it 2 days after she passed away, and it was nowhere to be seen. Do you think the owner pilfered it?" "I hate to admit it, but the box was disturbed." Bley let out an exhalation. The data had vanished. With an nod, "Miss Marple, I don't remember what was inside, but he seemed uncomfortable, and it had to do with something that happened years ago, involving 2 people. Joy and someone else. A burial ground was mentioned, but no death certificate was found." The voice of Miss Marple was gentle. Are you saying that a burial was held informally? Miss Marple held steadfast in the face of Blais's apparent lack of response. You've been incredibly beneficial, Mr. Blaise. Also, he gazed up with a fierce expression, which indicated his courage. Brave keeping quiet is often safer than being useful. The village was once again peaceful and bathed in golden light when she returned home shortly before sunset. It was the silence of things left unsaid, unburied, and undone, not a tranquil stillness. The maid, Jane, stood shakily on the step, whispering, "I need to speak with you," while she sipped warm milk by the window later that night. A knock sounded at the door. Nodding, Miss Marple said, "Of course, come in, my dear." As she completely opened the door, sitting on the edge of a chair, Jane wrapped her hands in her apron and said, "I remembered something from the day Felicity died. Something I didn't think meant anything." As she sat across from her patient, Miss Marple, Edgar, and Celia's voices could be made out in the hallway. As I made my way to the pantry after retrieving the tea tray, Celia, a rapid nod from Jane, indicated her agreement. They weren't yelling, but their tone was tense, as if they were about to explode. Was what they said about Jane swallowed audible to you? With one exception, Edgar did say, "If you speak you're finished too." As for Celia, she remarked, "Then maybe it's time." For an extended while, Miss Marple remained silent. Standing up, she pulled the drapes. Outside, the wind rustled the hedges on the inside. A change occurred. The past was rising slowly like foxglove through poisoned soil, and someone, somewhere in Charlie Hollow, was getting ready to strike again. Unit 8, according to Miss Marple, little towns don't keep secrets. They bury them until the right person comes along with the proper tool. In Charlie Hollow, that tool was often words, memories, and discussion, not metal. After hearing Jane's confession late at night, Miss Marple set off from her cottage the next morning, intent on reaching a specific location. Graves in the churchyard gently sloped upwards past St. Michael's Chapel. While she was walking past the older portion, she swerved towards a corner. The roads were uneven and the headstones were worn down by time and weather. Moss curled around the edges, and many of the names were long forgotten, even by those who had lit candles in memory of them. A stone that was different from the others was concealed beneath an overgrown vine. Regret is the only word etched into the surface, with no dates or names. For a while, she just stood there, thinking about the term. An admittance rather than a name, a monument rather than an identity. Someone hadn't wanted the truth etched plainly on this stone, even if they had paid for it. She heard a twig snap behind her. She pivoted and discovered Celia Durs standing a short distance away, holding a solitary wildflower. Miss Marple offered a warm grin. "You knew I'd come here." Despite her nod, Celia remained motionless. "I used to come often," she pointed out, "but it frightened me. The grave, no, here was." The concept that nobody else appeared to recall. Miss Marple delicately pointed at the stone. "Felicity cautioned me once that if I were to suddenly stop talking, it wouldn't be due to old age, but rather someone else's fear catching up with me. I never heard her say it out loud, but I knew it was someone whose throat was working before." She answered. Closer, Miss Marple took a step back. "Who was buried here?" Celia, the young woman, gazed at the flower below. "A girl, probably no older than 15, passed away before I got to Charlie Hollow. However, Felicity mentioned her once, stating that her name was Maggie. Accused herself of being involved in a scandal that would remain undocumented. During a pregnancy, a father whom no one dared blame." Celia nodded in agreement. Despite Felicity's knowledge that Miss Marple was telling the truth, her tone remained unchanged. Whispered by Celia for weeks, She assisted Maggie in concealing her, but then disaster struck. After Maggie passed away, there was no ritual to mark her burial. Someone persuaded Felicity that going to the police would do more harm than good, so she backed down. Who? She never said anything other than that it would make two people's lives disappear. Celia answered as Miss Marple's question piqued her interest. Miss Marple's eyes stayed fixed on the stone until she mentioned that he was still in the village. Regret, confession, and warning were rolled into one. Celia placed the flower at the foot of the grave without weeping or shaking, but her voice was distant and icy when she spoke again. As far as Felicity was concerned, she would incorporate it into her upcoming reading. A poem retelling a narrative rather than a name. Edgar Gresham overheard Miss Marple's cautious nod. As far as I could tell, they were arguing a lot, and Miss Marple leaned down and delicately touched Celia's arm. I'm afraid that right now is really risky, but you're incredibly courageous. Inspector Cray showed up at Miss Marple's cottage later in the day. Without waiting for an invitation, he said, "We've had a break." His eyes glazed over from a previous rain, and his coat still somewhat damp. It is not agricultural arsenic, but rather a shared or old rat poison that is utilized in Felicity's tea. No prompted by Miss Marple, it has undergone rigorous laboratory purification. Made a purchase through a healthcare provider, surprising route for locals, exactly, he said. Only one resident would have legitimate access. He was spared the rest of the sentence by Miss Marple. Ernest Hemingway Craig gave a subtle nod. His license has been revoked, but his former contacts getting something discreetly wouldn't be difficult though. As Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the window, she remained silent. Rain misted lightly against the glass. There's more, furthermore, Craig tacked. On the lock to Felicity's library door was found forced, according to Jane, who claims that someone has been in her house since her death. A little stack of papers remains. Nothing else of value has disappeared. Private correspondence that is likely quite old, but, to the correct observer, may be considered modern, according to what Miss Marple said. Gray paused, then leaned forward. Slightly, do you believe we've got enough to act? Miss Marple's voice was quite soft. Not quite there yet. We seem to be lacking something. Isn't that the killer's error? Cray frowned. He hasn't made one. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Well, he does have that night, shortly before sunset. Miss Marple had an unexpected guest. He is simply unaware of it at the moment. Lawrence Ashcombe's performance failed to hide his exhausted and lifeless appearance. I know I've been evasive, he started, standing awkwardly outside her doorway, but I never meant for Felicity to die. Intent, according to Miss Marple, delicate cleaning is usually ineffective. He collapsed into a chair after saying that she had blackmailed him years ago over an insignificant affair with a girl from the village. Relatively unsavory, but not illegal. She used it to cling to me, but then she abandoned me. When you touch down, he laughed cruelly. Her punishment was that. A present I couldn't decline without raising questions with a forward tilt. Miss Marple, he faced her directly and asked, "Did you poison her?" In response he said, "No, but I know who might have tried." As she waited, the readings that Felicity performed frightened Edgar Gresham, who claimed that she wielded words like weapons, said that eventually she'd select the wrong moment and everything would unravel, and did it at his hands. Lawrence cast a downward glance. I guess it started to, and someone panicked. Section 9. The second body was discovered by the Vicaro just after 6 o'clock. While doing his evening rounds, Reverend Paul Linton observed the door to the flower shed jar and made sure the chapel was locked. A thin sliver of dim light filtered through the grass. It was common for curious and slightly irritated kids to forget to close it after using borrowed seats. He walked up to it. Edgar Gresham lay stooped over the shelf where the hymnals were kept, his torso pressed against the wall with his legs curled awkwardly beneath me. A shattered teacup lay on the floor next to him. The room had a subtle aroma of earth and dried roses. Absolute silence, devoid of any sign of life again. That expression of startled comprehension frozen on the face Inspector Cray didn't even reach the chapel gates when Miss Marple stood there, her knitting basket dangling. Unattended, her eyes narrowed in concentration. Cray grimaced as he approached her with one hand. "He's dead," he said. "No question," she agreed. "Same expression as Felicity. Exactly the same. And when the vicar discovered him, the cup was still warm. Identified mint aroma. Maybe tea would work instead of flowers as a delivery option." Craig scowled. "You think? This is retaliation." As Miss Marple gazed up at the sky, where dusk was drawing ink-like lines over the horizon. "So the first poisoning was the silence before the story, and this is the second," she said. "No," she whispered gently. "I think this is preventative." The news of Edgar Gresham's death sent a fresh ripple through Charlie Hollow. It was one thing to part ways with the eccentric, polarising Felicity. Edgar was a constant, but Felicity, the type of man who, when someone got a hold of him, debated at council meetings, paid his bills with checks, and expertly sliced the roast for every Sunday dinner. Upset individuals. The word reached Celia, darker, at the local post office. By the time she reached Miss Marple's cottage, she appeared as though the color had drained entirely from her eye. "Didn't want him dead," she replied, voice quivering. "Whatever. He did whatever they both did. I just wanted it out." Tea was delicately poured by Miss Marple. "What were your expectations for the outcome?" "Celia, maybe embarrassment. It was my hope that no one would volunteer to drink it, but I guess I was wrong." Her study by Miss Marple, with great concern. There was no leftover tea, and he sipped from his own thermos. Frozen in her place was Celia. "Did you say he knew what I was about to say?" Mildly, Miss Marple said that Edgar Gresham was not the type to put his faith in food that had been cooked by others. Whispering became Celia's voice. He was then presented with it by an individual. Though she remained silent, Miss Marple's thoughts were already shifting. After Felicity's threats of exposure, Edgar attempted to exert control over her, but he, too, was subdued by a way that was both calm and silent. Desperation had joined guilt as an active factor. Later that day, Inspector Cray came back with some preliminary toxicology findings. Replica substance, identical shipment this time. He mentioned arsenic in a mint infusion that was diluted. The chapel kitchen did not contain any trace materials. Thus, the lethal dose was transported probably in the insulated mug, but no prints, Craig verified. It was cleaned by someone. Miss Marple considered this is everything normal at Edgar's house. The only strange thing is that his ledger, which he used to record his personal payments, has gone stolen. A quick glance at Miss Marple's knitting basket washed over her. "I need you to do something for me," she replied, setting it down. "Give it a name and access parish cemetery records. Can you tell me who was responsible for planning Maggie's funeral?" A headstone without a last name, no family information, and payment from that time 17 years ago. Cray blinked and nodded without asking why. Late in the afternoon, Lawrence Ashcombe went back to the cottage of Miss Marple. He shone less hesitation this time. "It seems like Felicity was just the beginning, according to Edgar, who I heard about." Mrs. Marple motioned for him to take a seat. "By the way, You mentioned that Felicity used secrets as a means of controlling others. Could you tell me if Edgar ever confided in you? Lawrence was hesitant. Not exactly, but I do recall an incident after a council meeting when he was visibly intoxicated and ranting about how bodies should remain buried and forgotten. Did he bring up anyone else? He claimed Felicity had embellished it into a story, and stories, when read with the wrong tone, could be harmful. With a forward tilt, Miss Marple, Lawrence, what else? He choked. Instead of whispering or threatening, he said she would read it out loud, recite it verbatim to the entire garden. Before she passed away, Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on his. The voice of Lawrence cracked. She said, "No, Mr. Ashcombe. I was the last person she trusted, and now I've let her down. You provided her with an opportunity to shine. She decided to make use of it." Miss Marple finished threading her table that night. 2 deaths, 1 buried girl, 1 threatening note, unrevised will, and 2 glasses of tea laced with arsenic, but only 1 killer. The inevitable slip-up that she anticipated. No one could practice their reaction, so all she had to do was offer the perfect cue and wait. 10th chapter. Charlie woke up the following morning with a shiver. The sun's rays couldn't penetrate the hollow that had crept into collars and joints. A misleading luminosity it exhibited. Shallow, cold, thin, the sort of day when truths broke more easily than twigs. The marmalade toast that Miss Marple had prepared was left unattended next to her notebook. Instead of drawing conclusions, her pen lingered on questions. A variety of shadows remained to be positioned beneath the light. We needed a change for her. More of a response than an admission she had it all figured out by mid-morning. Her journey to the Ashcombe home began with a handwritten note in her meticulous vintage handwriting. As Lawrence anxiously pried open the door, Miss Marple spoke with a smile that never once seemed like a question. "Wonder if you might help me host a small gathering." A meeting, he echoed with perplexion. Nothing fancy, relatively few individuals. In Felicity's garden, a reading in honor of the deceased. Despite the tribute, he was hesitant. "A final one," she said. Felicity had something prepared. "There should be an oral reading, in my opinion." Lawrence's mouth went dry. She asked gently, "Do you have it?" "I do now," but she didn't elaborate on how. Instead of asking, he just nodded. At 4 o'clock, everything in the garden was in place. The semicircle of iron chairs was once again arranged. On the sideboard, a tray of teacups lay unfilled. In defiance of the passing of time, the faded flowers remained steadfast. Guests numbering just 6, Lawrence sat anxiously in the middle. Celia, darker, pale but composed, uncertainly positioned near the trellis. Jane, the maid, stands. Inspector Cray, who appears bored but is actually paying attention, silent and unintelligible. Mr. Blay and Althea Gresham standing before them with her hands folded. Miss Marple, Edgar's sister-in-law, dressed in black laces, if the whole thing were beneath her. A final reading was made by Felicity Murkison before she passed away. She spoke softly. "I think we should hear it now. It's part poetry and part confession." She was going to share it in this garden, but her voice was taken from her. She turned to Lawrence. He stood slowly, opened the leather folio. He started reading. The script that Miss Marple had given him. His voice, which was often sharp and dramatic, was more steady than he had anticipated. Tragedy struck as a girl went missing, not once, but twice. Those onlookers let the shower of silence, which they dubbed pity, to fall, but in reality it brought them anguish. No names were mentioned, and no charges were made, but the weight of the words was clear to those who listened. Celia clutched her hands tightly in her lap. When Blatley lowered his gaze, Altha swiftly scrawled something, while Cray, for the first time, Altha moved in her seat. She clenched her teeth and stood tall. Lawrence carried on. As time passed, the story was sealed, but untold tales eventually decay. At that, Miss Marple stepped forward with a low voice. Felicity scribbled this down. She gave it to someone she thought wouldn't make it through the night to read it. Her housekeeper received it from her and then gave it to me. Angry, Altha raised her head. Wow, that's completely ridiculous. Eliza departed a while back. She did. Miss Marple agreed, but not before storing away this paper rather than Felicity's house. It was discovered in the old tea chest that she had given to the parish, hidden beneath a layer of unused lace. With a quick look, Cray met Altha's gaze. She avoided looking at him. Poet Lawrence completed the work. Then there was a period of quiet. Miss Marple allowed it to settle. Then she turned to the group and spoke softly to fatalities and the same poison. How peculiar. And yet Felicity never drank from anyone else's cup, only the one she poured herself. Edgar, however, drank from his thermos dry and fingerprint-free, frowning. Blatly, whoever murdered Felicity had no intention of the cup may have been switched. According to Miss Marple, the purpose of the vial concealed near the sundial was probably to provide an explanation at a later date. Possibly even frame an individual frame who Jane asked quietly. Miss Marple looked to Lawrence. Maybe the very person whose prints were supposed to appear on the vial. Someone who appeared to be guilty right from the bat. Lawrence choked on his swallow. But Edgar's death, as Miss Marple pointed out, was different. It was strategic, not a result of fear. The delivery was precisely controlled by the dosage, and the thermos was cleaned clean. It wasn't a coincidence. Her gaze went slowly, unflinchingly, toward Altha. After Felicity passed away, everyone looked to Isla, who calmly asked why someone would try to quiet Edgar. "Are you implying that I killed my own brother-in-law?" she asked with a subtle lip split, but her stance remained unchanged. "No, since you informed me that you hadn't been in the house until after the reading. I'm taking Miss Marple's statement as an indication that you tried to cover up the fact that you were in Felicity's garden the day before she died." "Yes, I did," yet Miss Marple persisted nonetheless. "After Felicity departed to retrieve biscuits, Jane recalled seeing you in the kitchen just before the tray was ready to be made. Just 3 minutes remained, and during that time, 1 cup may be adjusted." After a single blink, Altha grinned. Neither denial nor shock characterized it. Resignation was involved. "There's no way to establish that," Miss Marple said, "but poisoners rarely confess. They slip, and you just did slowly." Cray rose to his feet. It was Mrs. Gresham who lost her temper. Felicity adored being in charge. She damaged people for fun. She planned to read everything aloud and didn't care who died as long as she got her way. "You silenced her," Edgar cautioned, "since no one knew better. He had promised to work with me when I told him about her situation, but then he betrayed me by claiming I would be the one to take the fall if anything leaked." "You silenced him." In the end, Miss Marple concerned, Altha buried her palms in her lap. After a while, people started talking again. This time, though, it was finished. Section 11. As Inspector Cray read Altha Gresham, her right send helped her to her feet. The only thing she could muster was a subtle, bitter smile. She sat quietly beneath Felicity's rose arbor, her hands folded across her spine. "It wasn't the poison that killed her," she murmured as she passed Miss Marple. "Nobody ever responded to her because it was the performance, always the performance." The police cruiser rolled along the lane with little ceremony. The locals did not congregate from behind the hedges. No one looked. Silence like that betrayed exhaustion more than reverence. The air weighted with relief and regret. Little Miss Marple lingered in the garden far after everyone else had departed. Assembling the seats was aided by Lawrence Ash. Celia had left with Jane, arm in arm, without a word. Bley had disappeared almost instantly, as though the day had eliminated any social duty. Miss Marple was the only one left in the garden, and the last rose petals were falling to the moist grass. Sitting with her notebook, she allowed her thoughts to settle rather than writing. Despite her lack of popularity, Felicity was an essential figure. She understood the gravity of whispered things and attempted to speak up in the latter moments. But the gospel of truth seldom arrived too late to save. Yes, it was a release, but redemption wasn't an automatic. Without a word of lament but of caution, she remembered the unmarked grave with regret. Arriving in the chapel archives first thing the following morning, Miss Marple found Cray waiting, with a folder open on the table. "It's as you suspected," he said, passing her the page. 17 years ago, a girl listed only as deceased. Trauma in a death court setting, the parish arranged the burial and paid for it in cash. She did not consult any of the families involved. There was no coroner's report. A woman who only provided her initials paid for the headstone 6 weeks after. It was ordered, and the funds were deposited into Edgar's account by Bley. AG. The handwriting on the document was traced by Miss Marple. Confident, neat, and crisp, the letter discovered in Felicity's drawer was a perfect match. "Alpha, I will steal everything from you if you read this out loud." Aspiration to remove her Marple, Miss whispered Felicity wouldn't budge from her agreement. She didn't think silence offered safety. Instead, she saw it as a poison of a different type. Craig nodded slowly, not out of hatred but guilt. Leaning on the desk, "Cray, even if it's not always justice, at least something has come to light, and you believe the justice was done." When Miss Marple closed the folder, Lawrence Ashcombe arrived at Miss Marple's door 2 days afterward. With one hand, he carried a battered book of poetry, and with the other, he pulled out a crumpled envelope, saying, "This came to my house." Inside was a folded note with only my name and no return address. The ink was bleeding at the margins and old splotchy. Lawrence read it nonetheless in case something were to happen to me. The best way to get someone to listen is to read it aloud. His red-rimmed eyes met Miss Marple. I believe she knew all along that this was the end game. She did it regularly. That, according to Miss Marple, was both her blessing and her curse. Lawrence encouraged me to continue reading poems by holding up the book, probably not in the garden, but rather in the chapel. A weekly dose of peaceful reflection. With a subtle smile, she inquired about a new ritual. Rather a kinder one. He returned to the lane and dropped the note off with her before returning to stand in the leaf-peeling fall breeze. On that particular evening, Miss Marple returned to her parlour, this time adorned with a cosy shawl and her needles left undone. A faint crackling of fire echoed through her head as she pieced together the last pieces of the puzzle, which linked them not via violence but by motive. Fear had covered up Maggie's death, Edgar had quietly and effectively enabled it, and Felicity's readings had grown to brazen. So Edgar threatened to turn on Ayla, reckoning that poetry could convey what a confession could not. Felicity, torn between the truth and her guilt, decided to perform the story. And there was someone else, maybe Lawrence, or even Celia, who knew something but was too afraid to say anything until Felicity pulled the curtain back. Amidst the chaos, a girl whose name had not been entirely forgotten lay beneath the surface. And to death's one, accidental and the price of panic, the other premeditated, and the act of survival both caused by poisoning. Chapter 12. Miss Marple beholds the letter on her table. Felicity had foretold that she might not see the final verse delivered, but she had faith that another would. The rain returned the next morning, this time in a more meditative style that pushed stillness into corners and distorted the edges of windows, not the brittle sideways drizzle of autumn. For the first time in days, Miss Marple sat down at her writing table with a fresh sheet of paper, a fountain pen, and a calm mind. Instead of writing all at once, she took her time and let the complete picture form again, this time without making any assumptions or being in a rush. She started to lay it down only after the pattern was obvious. As you requested, I am providing Inspector Cray with my whole understanding of what happened, backed up by motivated behavior, contradiction, and confession, rather than relying solely on confession. First and foremost, the crime, the circumstances behind the death of a girl named Maggie 17 years ago were never made public. The cause of her death was most likely trauma experienced during her pregnancy, which was hidden because of the reputations of individuals involved. Edgar Gresham, who oversaw the burial and fabricated paperwork to make sure the matter went away, had a profound effect on Felicity Murkison, who had assisted the girl and was compelled to remain silent. Altha, his sister-in-law, whose function was murky until very recently, paid for the anonymous headstone as an act of shame and self-control. The past's triumphant return, several months before to her passing, Felicity started making plans to tell Maggie's tale. She planned to read it aloud at her yearly garden party while it was disguised as poetry, under the assumption that art might convey meaning beyond what accusations could. She probably amended her will during this time as a last act of self-determination. Those who could have grounds to censor her felt the strain of her transformation. The initial killing, Elizabeth Murkison, in my opinion. The plan was to intercept Felicity's message, not her life. Hence the poisoning was not planned in the conventional sense. It appears that someone had the intention of framing Lawrence Ashcombe, possibly by placing a vial with his fingerprints near the sundial. Unfortunately, a poisoned cup derailed Felicity's regimented and intimate tea time. She took a sip from the vial and turned the switch on herself. An awkward safety measure was the small glass vial tucked away in the garden. The plan was to discover it after the focus had changed to the wrong individual, but Felicity's demise ruined that. The subsequent panic was evident in the reactions of everyone there, particularly Altha, whose composure wavered just briefly when faced with Felicity's book's margin note. A second homicide, Ernest Hemingway. It seems like this was carefully orchestrated. Edgar was put to quiet when Felicity's poem reappeared and was read aloud in the garden where he had buried his sorrows. His trusty thermos, which he had put the poison in, was emptied of its contents. It wasn't a panic attack, and nobody saw it. After Felicity's true intentions became known, Altha feared that Edgar would betray her. In fact, he had previously threatened to. It was her move that was initially criticized. Finally, the hint I mentioned that Jane had seen her in the kitchen before the tray was prepared, and she answered right away. So it wasn't in Altha's words, but in her corrections, that the problem arose. That is not the response of someone who is innocent. Rather, it is the reaction of someone who has mentally recreated the crime and presumed that their details were already known. That was the slip, and it proved everything else. I had never spoken Jane's name. Warm regards, rather than Marple. Jane, after carefully placing the note inside an envelope, she sealed it. Like all vital truths, it would be handed on. Later that day, she crossed paths with Celia Douce at the rose hedge. even though the girl appeared older than she did a week before. Her demeanor had become much more composed. Not joy, but a middle ground. The full narrative was never conveyed to me by her. Celia whispered only fragments from time to time. We just have pieces to work with. However, if they are organized properly, they are sufficient, Miss Marple said. Naturally, will individuals converse, Miss Marple said, but not for long. Villages like these have a short memory for sorrow and a long one for reputation. They strolled in quiet for a minute, listening to the rain fade into a drizzle. Probably everyone here wished Felicity would just stop talking. Celia nodded in agreement, but Miss Marple was never really on board. Miss Marple got back to her knitting that night, with the fire burning low and her teacup steaming beside her. Outside, the rain gently brushed against the stones of the chapel. "Yeah, did she get it?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, but she got it. She spoke in her own voice that night. One of them was unidentified and simply said regret. At least someone had remembered its meaning, and chapter 13 of the narrative was read aloud at last. Not quite normal, but at least somewhat normal. Life in Charlie Hollow resumed a week later. While delivering letters, the postman went back to whistling. As the children pedaled by Felicity Murchison's gate, the garden that had previously hosted the performance and revealed the secrets, re-emerged with the defiant tenacity characteristic of English soil. As she sat by her front window, Miss Marple knitted delicate blue yarn in long, meticulous rows. There was still some hope in the teacup next to her. She was in no hurry to get anything done now. Perhaps more than anyone else, she finally grasped the concept that happy endings happen at their own pace. The door was pounded. Resuming his ceremonial role, Lawrence Ashcombe casually handed her a brown envelope, explaining, "I discovered this in a folder Felicity once gave me to hold." She warned against opening it until everything was in disarray. The envelope was carefully turned in Miss Marple's fingers as she grabbed it. When he inquired, "Did it fall apart?" she paused for a while to wonder. True, she did say that everything fit together at last. Felicity's handwriting was on a single piece of paper. "Jane, you have always been the best listener, so here is just a note, no poem or puzzle. If they find this, then I've failed, but if you're reading it now, perhaps I've succeeded instead. Tell them what happened, tell them everything, and remind them the silent ones aren't always harmless. FM with care." Miss Marple enveloped the message. She wanted this, Lawrence stated the full thing told, exposed, remembered being the sole bearer had become old for her. Miss Marple's response came from him gently nodding. "I'll keep the reading circle going," he said. "Smaller poems, gentler stories, but still aloud." Faintly, she grinned. Good, not all voices need to tremble to be worth hearing. He departed with a low-key farewell, and Miss Marple sat with her hands on the note. 2 days later, the village held a second memorial, not for Felicity this time, but for the unnamed. The graveyard had been emptied. The mossy stone had a tiny plaque beneath it that said only regret. Margaret, whose voice had been stifled, is now remembered as it reads. She had company. No one lingered beside the stone for as long as Celia. Jane set a daffodil at the base of it. Even the normally restrained Inspector Cray took off his hat for a minute of silence before stepping aside. Perched on a bench beneath the yew tree, Miss Marple observed with her umbrella draped over her lap. After the ritual concluded, she lingered behind, observing the rainfall on the memorial stone as if it were a punctuation mark. With hushed tones, she addressed no one in particular. 2 people died, a girl who was almost forgotten, and a lady who revealed the truth too late. Later that night, Cray paid Miss Marple one last visit, almost as an afterthought, but yet before it mattered. In his words, she stand trial simply. Motive and circumstantial evidence are sufficient. We were able to retrieve Edgar's misplaced ledger. Among its contents are notes from the anonymous payments clinic pertaining to the girl. It'll hold up whenever justice is late, Miss Marple would nod. Standing awkwardly beside the fireplace, Craig fixed his gaze on her mantel, where a delicate porcelain vase contained a solitary rose. I've worked a long time, Miss Marple, she spoke softly. I've seen all kinds, but this one, yes, she wasn't cruel. Exactly. He then remained silent, nodded slightly, and departed, unlike the others I've witnessed. Miss Marple was terrified, and she agreed that fear was more damaging than malice. There was no longer any necessity for the letter or an explanation of what had transpired in Charlie Hollow, so that night Miss Marple went back to her knitting. After everyone had heard the narrative, the silences ended and the garden that had been poisoned with blossoms of honesty blossomed. No one would ever forget Maggie, and time had given the tomb a name. Still, Maggie was no longer laid to rest in the gentle recesses of recollection. As she reached for her teacup, Miss Marple thought it was the best possible outcome that she had been heard.